Welcome to 3 Point Landing, where we talk about movies, comics, and video games. We're your hosts. I'm Misha,
I'm Matthew.
and here we go.
We're here to talk about the movie The Joker.
And today we're going to go a little bit into the background of the character, give our thoughts on our favorite Jokers, and then we'll tell you what we think of the movie.
Yeah, Misha, you're we're both big ass nerds, but you're the big fan of the Bat mythos, Batman, all that stuff. I mean, I know it's cliche to talk about being a Batman fan in our current pop culture saturated landscape, but that's definitely a character you and whose universe and love. So tell me, what do you think of the Joker, as he's been represented so far in the media?
Well, as far as the Joker goes, I mean, depending on what year we're talking about, he can be any number of things. I mean, he's like Batman, right? In that, depending on the decade, depending on the audience, depending on what's popular at the time, he could be funny, he could be silly, he could be scary, he could be a terrorist, or in this case, he could just be a guy having a really bad day, in this movie. I mean, he's been around for 79 years at this point, and there's no single villain more identified as being one of Batman's enemies than this guy. I mean, there's just something about the image of a guy who's just always smiling. There's just something sinister about that. I mean, look at that. Last month we had It, right? I mean, there was another killer clown for you, and now we have another one in Joaquin Phoenix's version.
You think they're going to ban clowns in America now?
I have no idea. But that was a thing for a while, wasn't it? There were police were reporting random clown sightings.
Yeah. And kids were people were reporting their kids being endangered by clowns and stuff like that. But anyway, I like to stay back on topic with the Joker. Personally, my reference for the Joker, most other people our age, would be the Jack Nicholson version, from the 1989 Tim Burton Batman films.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, essentially he was playing himself, but he was clearly having a good time doing it.
And such that he was the guy who headlined the 1989 Batman film, am I right?
Absolutely. But, that's something that they had to do at the time because his name was what gave it credibility in the same way that hiring Marlon Brando for Superman did 10 years prior. It's because nobody thought that you could do a serious Batman movie. After the 60s, they thought Batman had to be silly. It had to be bam, pow, all these cartoon colors, all the silly bat names. But Jack Nicholson, he helped legitimize that film. And Michael Keaton was pretty good too as Batman.
Yeah, and the thing I like the most about Nicholson's take, which I think is very iconic, is just how smarmy he is and how much of the character is kind of already present before he turns into the Joker after falling into one of the many chemical vats that exist in Gotham that
I know
that are not, they would solve their crime problem in Gotham if they kept those vats closed. They just put a lid on it. Just put a lid on all the vats.
And you know what? Another thing that Gotham has besides chemical vats is skylights. I mean, seriously, every fucking building has a skylight in that city.
That leads directly to an open chemical vat.
Let's see. Oh, another good one. Another one of my favorite Jokers, of course, is Mark Hamill's Joker on Batman the Animated Series. That is just fantastic. I mean, here was a guy who everybody knew as Luke Skywalker. He's your favorite, good guy, Jedi Knight and all that. And now he is just the scariest version of the Joker that you ever heard. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, he's personally like a lot of people, he is my favorite Joker. I think essential to how his performance works is the fact that he plays his laughter like a musical instrument. So, there's a lot of I don't want to try to do a Hamill or embarrass myself here, but sometimes he goes a little high and then he goes a little low, and it's and the laugh follows with it.
Yep.
And it's really, really it's a really compelling performance, one that has allowed him to play the character for I'd say nigh on 27 years.
Yeah, he still plays him in random DC animated movies, the occasional animated show. He was the Joker in all those Arkham games.
Yeah, and the video games,
Hmm.
but yeah, the video games. What I like about the video games and the cartoons and all these different Mark Hamill takes is that even if it's the same actor, and even if he brings many of the same tools or instruments to playing the character, they're actually all different versions of the character. Like like the one from the Batman is definitely from the Batman video games is definitely more murderous, more psychotic,
Right,
more
right.
rated M for mature, so to speak.
Hmm.
Whereas the one from the animated series is very Looney Tunesy.
I guess you could say that, but I think given the right episode or treatment, the animated one could be just as murderous.
Oh yeah, totally. I wasn't saying like Looney Tunesy as a. I wasn't denigrating like the performance or suggesting anything like it was anything less than it is. So much as I'm saying like his performance tradition really like speaks to that sort of like classical animated like quality.
No, definitely, definitely. But I think what I like about the Joker, I mean, same as with Batman or even other long-lived characters like James Bond, is that you can have completely different takes in the same character, and they'd all be entirely valid, depending on
Mm-hmm.
where the audience is coming from. But something I've found is that when it comes to characters like that who've been around forever and they have different takes, audiences or fans rather, they tend to latch onto the first one that they came into contact with,
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
right?
Yeah, like I mean, we always have an intimate relationship with like the versions of
You have an intimate
characters.
relationship with the Joker?
Well, by intimate, I mean like, I mean you kid, but I really
None of
mean
my
like,
business, man.
you, no, but you kid, but I'm talking about like how these characters can really like get in your head.
Right, right.
I mean, at the risk of sounding like a little Looney Tunesy myself,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
like a lot of I too like I don't consider myself as someone who has anarchic impulses or murderous impulses or
Mm-hmm.
even like insane clown impulses, but a lot of the Joker's worldview as communicated by both Jack Nicholson and Mark Hamill's versions of the characters really like get into my head. And maybe I'm only speaking for myself here, but because I spend a lot of time thinking about the psychology of characters, it's what I'm speaking to about having an intimate relationship with characters. That your first point of contact with the Joker being this or that, like as far as I'm concerned, gets in your head.
Well, seeing as I mean, you actually studied psychology, right? So, what do you think? What makes him so popular and scary at the same time? Why are people drawn to something like this, to a character like this?
I think there's a lot of an offhanded way of answering your question is that a lot of people talk about how Batman represents like a child or a man trying to impose order on a world that makes no sense to him.
Fair
One
enough.
that robbed him of his parents, that created crime and criminality and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, as his opposite, the Joker represents that impulse that we have, that sort of like dark secret we won't admit, in which maybe the world does not make sense. Maybe the world is unfair or unfeeling,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of people identify with Joker that way. And psychologically speaking, they sometimes like take catharsis from seeing him inflict his mayhem and his murderous impulses on that world that he sees. Like if fate and life is random, then why not just like have a laugh with it?
Right, and then here comes this guy in a leather cape who just wants to punch him in the face. But something I personally liked about the Joker, something that I got from the comics, was that they never committed to any specific origin for him. I absolutely adore that. And that is something that they nailed with Heath Ledger's in The Dark Knight,
Oh yeah.
where every time he would tell you about where he got his scars, the story would be different depending who he was talking to. And that is just, for me, that is absolutely the Joker, because you don't know where he's coming from. He could, all of those things could be true, all of those things could be false. Nobody really knows. And I think that contributes to that spirit of chaos that you mentioned in a way.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Like, I think what's really interesting about Heath Ledger's Joker, even though like if people talk about it as a very groundbreaking performance, and it is. I'm
Yeah.
not about to like deny that,
Yeah.
but I think he, like you said, spoke to that part of the character that had gone underexplored,
Mhm.
and the whole enigma aspect, I think, is also an interesting thing. I'm glad you mentioned that because one of my favorite things about the Batman Arkham Asylum games
Yeah.
is they talk about there's a recurring theme that goes underneath Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, which is the idea of curing mental illness or curing like everybody's so convinced that they're going to be the one guy or one person who's going to figure out the Joker and treat him and cure him and become celebrities out of it. And I love that bit of Joker where he's like, all right, he's going to let you in closer and closer and closer. And just when you think you've gained his trust,
right,
he's actually like drawn you into his web. He's very Hannibal Lecter.
That's exactly where Harley Quinn came from. She was one of the doctors who was treating him. She thought that she would end up writing some kind of an expose or a tell-all book. Next thing she knows, she's head over heels for the guy. When he couldn't give, he couldn't give a rat's ass about her. Well, depending on the time of day. He just treats her like garbage, but she loves him anyway. Okay. You want to go talking about the movie?
I do. I mean, like, one of the things what I really liked about the movie is that it goes into the origin of the character, and origins can feel like unnecessary sometimes, but it's an aspect of the character that really isn't considered or held up for consideration in previous takes in the character. And that's what made it like so fascinating. This Joker movie is that it tries to give like this full picture of where the character's like murderous impulses and insanity comes from.
For me, that was something. I don't know if I was entirely attracted to that prospect at the beginning, because again, I really like the fact that we don't know where he came from. We don't know how he came about. We only know the basics about him. He fell into a vat. He doesn't like Batman. This movie, just by virtue of being, a prequel, that put me on a little bit on guard, because I think there's a tendency in these kinds of films to over-explain where popular characters come from, where what their motivations are, or there's also a tendency to shrink the world of these characters, wherein 20 years ago everybody knew everybody, before they actually met each other. Everybody is connected to everybody. I mean, come on, Anakin built C-3PO. I mean, how small is the universe?
That's that kind of surreal thing they do in prequels where everybody's like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Exactly. And for me, I mean, as a moviegoer, I don't need to know the life story of the shark from Jaws for it to be scary. In fact, I think not knowing where that shark came from, that's what makes it scary, And with the Joker, I thought going in that the more I know about him, the less terrifying he's going to be, because he's going to be demystified. He's just going to be, he's got a tragic backstory. Well, tell you what, he actually does have a tragic backstory in this film. Boy, is it tragic, but it worked for me. It was done very well. It was presented in a way where you can see how circumstances mount and where his, quote unquote, madness comes from. I really enjoyed getting a look into his head that prior Batman films just didn't do, because, the focus is always on the guy with the cape.
Yeah. And I guess for me, the manner in which I differ from you, I guess, and by differ, I use like big air quotes here, is that I guess I knew going into this film that even if I'm not 100% like a fan of Origins, I have to meet the film on its own terms. So if the movie tells me this is going to be a Joker origin story, it's not my place to critique its validity as an origin movie, but just take it as it is. And I thought what elevated the film was how much attention to detail and craftsmanship and like in terms of themes and story ideas was present in the film. Like, for example, I thought it was very interesting how Arthur Fleck, the titular Joker, how he had interesting relationships with various prominent characters in the film. There's this whole like angle that they have where his mother really reveres Thomas Wayne. And he looks at Thomas Wayne differently or interestingly in that regard. He definitely has another relationship going on with this comedian, Murray Franklin, played by Robert De Niro, who is basically a comedian who has become so successful that he's turned into a late night talk show host.
Yeah, well, The story of the movie goes that Arthur Fleck is this low rent clown for hire, and he's played by Joaquin Phoenix. He lives alone with his mom. You know, they're not well off. They live in this tiny little apartment in the bad part of town with like a million steps to climb to get up there. And basically, their only source of comfort in their miserable life is watching Murray Franklin on late night TV. So I think that says a lot about the state, also not just of the haves and the have-nots. I mean, because Thomas Wayne is in the picture, but also it talks about the state of celebrity or of idol worship that we have, that we inculcate, and that's something that the movie touches on. Actually, in there's a bit there where Murray Franklin, Robert De Niro's character, actually responds to something that Flex says. He tells him that you don't know who I am. And that whole moment, you know, it just opens up this whole can of worms about how people think that they own celebrities. Yeah, I mean, stop me if I'm wrong.
No, I'm glad you brought it up because it's one of the most like compelling. I talked about this a couple of days ago with you.
Yeah.
It had me on the edge of my seat when he said that, and the fact that we don't get any definitive answers of where he's from or or what he's seen, it just made the whole remark more tantalizing to me. It says that the character of Murray Franklin, like there's more to him than just being a figure. Like there's a tendency in when we write characters or when we make movies or tell stories that some characters are they're just like props. Okay, here's the thing. Like, I was very fascinated by the fact that Arthur Fleck has a relationship with this young woman who lives in the same apartment as he and his mother.
Right.
And she, but for all intents and purposes, without really spoiling anything, is that she's not really a character. You know what I mean? Like, you don't really get a sense of what she believes, what she does.
No,
you don't
she's
get a sense.
she's just the woman next door.
Yeah. Like, and that's a thing. And that's a thing that happens in movies. Some characters don't graduate to full characters because it's not relevant or not necessary to the film.
But in this case, yeah, Robert De Niro gave that little side character more life and more of an interesting feel or placement in the story than you would have expected, because you expect, he's just a supporting character. But I think that's the rationale of getting someone like Robert De Niro to play him, because you expect Joaquin Phoenix to be amazing, right?
Yeah,
he's been great in everything. I first became aware of him in Gladiator in 2000. He was just a complete jerk of an emperor in that one.
Yeah, as Commodus, right? The man who basically gives Russell Crowe a hard time.
Absolutely, before stabbing him in the gut. But
spoilers for a 16-year-old movie, everybody.
2000?
Spoilers for a 19-year-old movie, everybody.
But yeah, I mean, Joaquin Phoenix just owns this movie. I mean, he is the Joker. And I think in casting somebody as big as Robert De Niro in a potentially smaller role, that says a lot about the commitment to fully fleshing out this world.
Yeah, because the thing is, there's a little bit of a cinematic intertextuality going on here. Is that, I think some critics have discussed this. I don't know. I don't really follow all the write-ups about this. But basically, the movie is sort of like a knowing reference to films of the 1970s, which have angry men, living in an urban environment that is oppressive or subject to economic despair.
Oh yeah, this movie has more in common with with Scorsese works like Taxi Driver or even The King of Comedy.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get at.
That has more in common with those movies than, let's say, Batman Returns or even The Dark Knight, because The Dark Knight was a crime film through and through, but this is a character study, and that's what makes it fascinating to me. That's also another thing that Robert De Niro brings to the table. He brings that history as somebody that who's been through stuff in those kinds of movies, and to see him here as a character who's made it to the big time, he has every right to be mad at Arthur Fleck for assuming that he knows what kind of person he is.
It's almost like, and this is a little bit of a cliche here. It's almost like there's a symbolic passing of the torch going on here.
Kind of, because in The King of Comedy, he was a struggling comic, like Arthur in this movie is portrayed to be. He was a struggling comic, and there was somebody that he looked up to. And in this case, there's a little bit of that. Before
even the names like sort of reference each other. Like, so in the Joker, his character's name is Murray Franklin, and in Kings of Comedy, he plays a struggling, barely funny comedian named Rupert Pupkin.
Right.
Rupert Pupkin, Murray Franklin. It's
I don't know. That is kind of a stretch.
Yeah. Well, like just the fact that it's 4 syllables and a kin at the end is close enough.
Okay.
It has to be deliberate without being too on the nose.
But let's talk a little bit about the controversy behind the film, because there are people who have been saying that this movie is going to incite violence in everyone who watches it. And what's your take?
Well, as I've said before, one can express reservations about, a film like this, which, centers around a man who is disturbed, who feels like wronged somehow and is driven to violence, and talk about how this might have a negative influence on people who receive that movie, who receive it. But it's another thing entirely to draw a direct line from movies to actual violence. And I think something we spoke about before is that even if someone were to commit an act of violence at a Joker movie screening or around the time that this film is in theaters,
right,
that person would have probably wanted to inflict harm on someone, without the movie.
I think regardless of whatever they watched on that particular day, they probably would have had it in them to begin with. I mean, I'm not an expert in mental health, and I apologize if I'm offending anybody, honestly. But I watched, years of, let's say, DuckTales. Come on. I mean, I'm not a quadrillionaire who swims through, my money bin, or, you don't watch things like, I don't know, Law and Order. I mean, and you don't watch shows like that and then suddenly walk away with a working knowledge of the American legal system. I mean, these are things that you have to, I don't want to say aspire to, but these are things that you have to consciously want. These are things that you have to go in with. And if it's something that you want to do, then it doesn't matter what you're watching. You're going to do it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, someone who's done a lot of work writing about media effects in psychology, it's already been debunked for a long time. The supposed direct line between violent media and violent actions.
Right.
This is not to suggest that violent media does not have any effect at all. Like, definitely, it gives. How should I say this? It reinforces ideas that are already there to some degree. But if anything, the one thing that I'm more concerned about with the film Joker is how, like any other movie, it can reinforce and codify certain ideas that might not be right, might not be appropriate. For example, I think Arthur Fleck's descent into madness is well documented, but it definitely gave me pause for concern when he's getting ready to embark on a life of violence, and he declares like, "Oh, I'm off my medication now."
Ah, yes.
And I'm like, okay, while it's true that medication can help many, mentally struggling individuals to deal with the problems that they have, I think it's a mistake to suggest that taking them off them, leading to like abnormal or deviant or violent behavior, is not a good look.
That's fair. And as far as painting people with mental health issues in a negative light, I can see where that would be a cause for concern. But as for inciting people to actual violence, to the point that they've had to apparently beef up security in some locations in the States, they've had to ban Joker cosplayers from attending screenings.
Oh, yikes, really?
I'm not even kidding. And they actually banned cast interviews at the Hollywood premiere the other day because they just were sick of having to answer these questions about whether or not the film will incite people to, go on a mass shooting.
This is like when they ask female actresses, how do you balance, like, how do you do work-life balance?
Yeah. How do you have it all?
How do you have it all? Yeah. No, you're like, and it's funny to me because I think a couple of days, or was it last night, somebody said, oh, the Joker Hollywood premiere went off without a hitch.
Yep.
No one brought a gun there
Mm-hmm.
and shot up some people. And while I'm glad that happened, and I'm glad
the fact that they had to be called out, that's kind of scary.
Well, it's reassuring to know that that wasn't a thing that's going to happen. But at the same time, I'm also like, for all these conversations about angry incel, the angry white male culture supposedly like floating around there. And they're worried that these kinds of people are going to shoot up a Joker screening.
Right.
And I'm like, first of all, those people don't target, they don't target screenings in Hollywood premieres. They target Walmarts and synagogues and mosques.
I'm not even going to claim to understand what goes on in the minds of that kind of person. But as far as I'm concerned, over the course of 3 movies, John Wick killed 200-300 people, and he made it look a whole lot cooler than this movie does. So if there's anyone who should be put on notice, it should be the purveyors of that kind of violence. Maybe those films actually go out of their way to make violence look cool. This one does not, and that's something that I actually appreciated. This one does not in any way make excuses for its lead character. It doesn't glorify the Joker. It doesn't make him out to be some kind of a misunderstood saint. He's still a crazy, for lack of a better word, he's still murderous. Yeah. He's still, there is something definitely wrong with this guy. And the film takes great pains to show us that, but it doesn't do it in a sympathetic light.
Yeah. All of this is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak, or the eye of the viewer. Like, if somebody walks away from that film thinking that the Joker is someone to aspire towards, or to emulate, a hero or whatever, that's their problem and not the movies necessarily.
That's true. Because if we're going to be censoring every possible little thing that could be offensive, then, I don't think there'd be anything left to watch or to listen to or to... I'm not saying that it's impossible to make media that doesn't offend, but I'm saying that with a character of this type who is inherently unstable, I think you kind of know what you're getting into when you go in.
Right? Yeah.
And the fact that it's R16 here in the Philippines, that's a big old keep out sign to all, to all the little children who are hoping to see the next big comic book movie.
Parents everywhere, please pay attention to the age rating labels on your popular entertainment. If it says R16, not for anyone under 16. And if you're picking up a video game that says M for mature, it ain't for anyone for under the 17-year-old range.
You sound like those announcements at the beginning of movies. Seriously, dude.
Well, lahat ng mga minors disappear.
Okay. All right. So, moving on?
Yeah, so there's still a few more weeks for Joker to run its course through the theaters. But I think it's safe to say that the commercial and critical success of this film is kind of a foregone conclusion.
I think so. Because of the controversy that's going on, I think people will check it out of sheer morbid curiosity.
At worst.
Yeah. And for my part, I genuinely enjoyed it. So I actually think that I won't be the only one. I think this movie is going to make a lot of money and it's going to get... Yeah, I actually think there could be awards in this thing's future.
Yeah. If I was a betting man, I'd say not necessarily any nomination for Best Picture or Best Screenplay, but I think we're looking at a Best Actor nomination for Joaquin Phoenix.
Oh, absolutely.
Do I think he deserve it? Does he? Do I think he deserves it? Not necessarily. Do I think he kind of maybe blew his wad a little bit in some scenes? Sure, but it doesn't change the fact that I think it was a virtuosic performance from him overall. And I think moving forward, what this means for the DC universe, or not universe, but rather the DC brand of movies, of motion pictures, could be really interesting and might have interesting implications. What do you think, Misha? What does this mean if that now that Joker is quite possibly going to be a success, and what that holds for the future of those movies?
Well, for my part, the cool thing about it is that it sets up a couple of things. So it could go any number of directions. But from the very beginning, Todd Phillips, the director, has maintained that it's not necessarily a part of the bigger DC extended universe as it exists. And I think part of expressing that was setting it in the 1970s, right? Because the 1970s, what you said earlier, it helps to set that kind of a tone, that kind of a mood for a grittier kind of storytelling than we're generally used to from these kinds of comic book movies. Because even if Zack Snyder went dark and brooding with his movies, right, they weren't necessarily gritty. They were still glossy on some level. They were still all about the big money shot and the big special effects and the big action scenes. This one is about the nitty gritty of what would actually drive a man insane. This is something that we genuinely haven't really seen in this genre before. And I think that whatever direction they decide to go from this point, I would be very interested in seeing it, because we all know that they're making a new Batman film with Twilight guy, with Robert Pattinson. And I'm sorry, and maybe in a year's time, I won't be calling him Twilight guy anymore. He might impress us. We don't know.
I think that's the point. I mean, everybody will tell you that, everybody who's been following Pattinson's career, the few of them, will tell you that he's actually done a lot to sort of like display his thespic range.
Right.
And, we can talk all the live long day about how great he was in this movie or that movie, but these aren't necessarily star-making turns or career-defining moments.
Right.
And if his turn as Batman is successful, that's when the label of Twilight guy will fully fade away. I'd hazard.
I think he's been doing a pretty decent job in trying to distance himself from that role, because, I mean, even depending who you ask, he wasn't entirely happy with how that played out or the attention that it engendered. But
the impression I get is that he's very candid about what that character or what that role meant.
The paycheck?
Of it. Yeah, exactly. And rather than try to, because what many other actors would do is they would, like, after a few years, start shit talking. Start.
But this guy from the very beginning, he made no bones about it.
Yeah, and instead focus on what truly matters, which is like not necessarily distancing himself from the Twilight character, but more like focusing on the future and forging a new professional direction.
But as far as like
a little off topic, I think
it's all good. But as far as connecting this film to the greater universe at large, I mean, assuming that he's going to play a different kind of Batman than, let's say, what Ben Affleck was trying to do, or never got to do, depending who you ask. I don't know. I mean, I am fascinated to see where this Joker goes in terms of being a Bat villain. But given Joaquin Phoenix's age and the setting of the film, he would be around, I don't know, 60 years old by the time Batman is old enough to punch him in the face. And that movie would still have to be set in the 90s to be anywhere near, where this film is set. But, that's the cool thing about it, about Joker, is that they can do literally anything they want with it at this point. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing that. Something that's interesting is starting with Shazam and this film. They've said, Warner Brothers has said that the films aren't necessarily interconnected anymore, which I think is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing in that they won't be forced to make everything line up. I mean, I think that's part of the problem of what happened with Justice League, in that it was too much and too fast, because they really wanted to get their interconnected universe going.
Yeah, it was very like, I wouldn't call it a mistake, but it's a very inorganic approach the way they handled it.
Actually, I don't think that it would have been necessarily bad, to be perfectly honest. Putting a whole team together in a first movie and introducing it them as such, because that's what, like, Guardians of the Galaxy did.
Yeah, it's not impossible. I mean,
it's not impossible.
We've seen television shows where, like, the cast is 7 characters,
right? And you meet them in 40 minutes.
And technically only 2 or 3 of them are really leads,
right?
But they use future installments or future episodes or future to storytelling moment opportunities to
Right.
build on the rest of the cast. And that could have been a thing that, like, an ideal version of the Justice League or any other like ensemble film would have been like, here are your pivotal characters and everybody else is just kind of there.
That's fair. But yeah, so as if you ask me, honestly, as much as I would love to see Joaquin Phoenix as the Joker going toe to toe with Batman, Superman, the rest of the Justice League, or any of those guys, I don't feel that he necessarily has to, but it would be fun to see. It really would be, if they were able to do that. In fact, the next Wonder Woman is set in 1984, so who knows what could happen, right?
Yeah. Honestly, what I'm interested in finding out is whether the Joker and maybe even Birds of Prey, the emancipation of one Harley Quinn, I believe is the full title, whether they will establish a creative blueprint of future films that are isolated or exist within their own unique eras. Like, who knows? Maybe we'll see a Riddler movie set in the 1980s, or maybe we'll see an Atom movie set in the 90s or something, like that kind of thing. Like, will that be rather than having individual films that aspire towards a coherent continuity, just create individual films to the best of their ability and worry about whether or not there'll ever be a chance to link them together later?
I think that's fair, because to be perfectly honest, I think that this one being set in the 70s and doing its own thing and not having any other super characters and having that plausible deniability that there are even any other super characters at all, that opens the door to a lot more different kinds of stories that they could tell. In fact, as far as telling different kinds of stories goes, I think that this blows the lid wide open on what they can do, who they can feature, and how they can feature them. Because as much as we love the interconnected universe format of, say, the Marvel films, it kind of handcuffs you in a way with regards to the stories you can tell. It's like, and you can see that even in some of the Marvel movies and the Marvel shows. It's like, how are they getting away with this when that guy has Thor's number on his cell phone, right? I mean, how did Winter Soldier happen when Cap could just call the Avengers to back him up? But this one with Joker, it shows us that you can have a good, successful comic book movie that doesn't necessarily rely on callbacks, connections, or even setups for sequels. You can have a good standalone film that does its own thing in its own way, and it still comes off brilliantly.
I think that's a note to end on.
Okay, so that was our first episode of 3 Point Landing. Big shout out to the folks at Big Baby Studios. Thank you for having us. Hopefully this is the first of many episodes. I'm Misha.
I'm Matthew.
And tune in next time for 3 Point Landing, where we talk about more geeky stuff. I have no idea what I'm doing.
3, 4